All right, it is 5 minutes after, so anyone who is later than this is just late. So I am very pleased to introduce Vanessa Wills, who will be giving us a talk today. She is a professor of philosophy at the George Washington University. Her talk is titled Heaven is a Place on Earth, the Abolition of Morality in Marxist Thought, and the talk will be about 40 minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break, then we'll have a Q&A of about 40 minutes. And thank you, Vanessa, for coming, and very much looking forward to the talk.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So I'll get right into it, but I'll say a bit. I'm going to start with some sort of larger framing remarks about what the broader project is. This is part of a book project, so I want to set it in that context, and then do a little bit of preliminary work to talk about what is it that I think is going on in Marx's thought with respect to morality at all, right? This is such a contested question in Marx scholarship. And then get to the sort of main course, right, which is trying to think about and place into context this claim that Marx makes, that the abolition of morality is something that is possible and desirable, and to talk about what it is that he might mean when he makes this claim. And importantly, whether Marx's claims about the abolition of morality make it reasonable to think that Marxism itself is an amoral theory, right? So yeah, I say this is part of a larger book project, and the larger manuscript itself is an exploration of Marx's moral thought. And this is looking at all of Marx's work. I even quote one of his early poems that he writes as a teenager. So all the way, from his sort of, romantic 18-year-old musings, up until, the publications that come out posthumously and so on. And the question is, what does Marx think about ethics? Or actually, that's one question. And another question is, what resources are there within a Marxist perspective to think about morality, right? Marxism, historical materialism, touts itself as a theory that is able to make sense of all of human existence, right, of all of human being, of all of human social life. And so if it is somehow silent or unable to really make good sense of moral theory, moral practice, what we take to be moral truths and so on, that would be a shortcoming, right? And it's one that Marxism has often been charged with, right, that it fails in this area. So I'll start by saying a bit about why you might think that Marxism is an amoral theory, or that any kinds of pretensions that Marxism might have to moral claims are misguided in some way. I'll say one thing is that it's interesting, depending on the sort of antecedent background and philosophical upbringing of the hearer, right? The whole existence of the debate can seem counterintuitive in two directions, right? So sometimes folks say, look, isn't it just, of course he has lots to say about morality. How can anybody possibly contest this? And the justifications for that are obvious, right? He makes all sorts of claims about what's good and bad for human beings, about what ought and ought not to be done. He condemns certain kinds of human endeavors and promotes others, right? So there's this whole seemingly, at least very robustly normative kind of language that Marx uses consistently throughout his writings. On the other hand, right, we got this famous claim that what Marx is up to is developing a scientific understanding of human social life, right? And more than that, of our place in the world, right? Of the relationship between human and nature, of developing this understanding of human life that sees us as continuous, right, with the rest of the natural world, and reconciling this seeming separation between the two. And part of what that might mean, right, is that the laws that govern all kinds of natural physical processes govern us as well. You get into a kind of very standard freedom and determinism argument. And the question is, well, is there a reason to think that the more that Marx attempts to explain by reference to a kind of economic determinist theory, the less he might be entitled, right, to make these kinds of moral claims, to issue moral judgments, because we think that the feasibility of those kinds of claims depends on the freedom of the agents who are under evaluation in this way, right? So there's this kind of very, very standard, familiar debate that then we see imported into Marx scholarship. And you get that kind of argument from people like Alan Wood in his book on Karl Marx, very, very influential among analytic philosophers, right? Is this kind of reading of Marx. But not just Wood, you know, also a figure like Louis Althusser, where there's this notion that we ought to periodize Marx, think of an early Marx, Marx the humanist, Marx the romantic, Marx the ethicist, and then the later Marx who gets serious, right? Gets scientific. You see this kind of picture in Daniel Brudney as well, Marx's attempt to escape philosophy, right? This notion that the later Marx, the real Marx, the serious Marx, right, is also a Marx that puts forward an amoral kind of vision, right, of human life. So, so as I said, my aim in this project, in this book project, is to answer the question, what did Marx himself think, and two, maybe more importantly, right, what can you legitimately have resources for within a historical materialist approach, right, to understanding human social life. And I take the position, right, that this periodization of Marx into early humanist Marx and later scientific Marx is too crude, right, and not very well supported, actually, by a consistent reading of his works, you know, throughout his life, right? That what we see is not a sharp rupture and break, but rather him developing new theoretical tools with which to develop the same picture that he begins developing in early works like the economic and philosophic manuscripts and so on. So the best argument in favor of the idea that there's a break and that we get a shift into a deterministic Marx that is also an amoral Marx, the best argument for that is the kind of Althusserian argument that we get Marx talking about the concept of alienation in the earlier works, and then at the time of the critique of the German ideology, he only uses the word alienation in an ironic sense to make fun of other people in that book, as he often does. And then we don't see him use it for a while. He actually does use it a couple times in Capital, but a long time passes where he just kind of gives up this particular concept. And the alienation concept is one of the most significantly and distinctively normative concepts that Marx invokes in the earlier writings, right? So you might think the fact that he gives it up, starts to make fun of it and poke fun at it, suggests that he's also turning his back on some of the normative commitments that go along with it. I'm happy to say more in Q&A. I won't have time in this talk to sort of trace the trajectory of that concept throughout his sort of later works. But for now, for the very moment, you'll have to trust me that, I'm sorry, this keeps misbehaving. Okay. But for the very moment, I'll just ask you to take me at my word, and I can unpack this more in Q&A. What actually happens is that he stops using the term, largely because of how the term is being used in the German philosophical circles in which he's operating at the time, right? He's attempting to distance himself from Feuerbach. He is implicitly accepting some of Max Stirner's critiques of Feuerbach, although he doesn't really admit it, right? But that's what's going on. And he stops using that term, but we see him continuing to describe the very same phenomenon all throughout his writings that in the earlier works he calls alienation. So he never stops talking about this separation of human beings from their from the products of their labor, right? He never stops naming this phenomenon where human beings lack agency, where their capacity to behave in ways that are fulfilling for them is diminished. He never stops talking about this phenomenon in which the products of our activity take on a hostile and external character and confront us as enemies, right? Suppressing our ability to flourish rather than promoting it. There's no place where Marx stops talking about that or stops identifying that as the principal ill of capitalism and of class society. And so although he stops using the term alienation, he never stops talking about alienation, never, right? And so if that's right, and if it's true, as I and most people who, people who, I and the folks who disagree with me, we're all in agreement, right? That the best reason to think that Marx shifts away from this more moral, ethical kind of normative vision towards a scientific one is that he stops using this term, then that's going to sort of, right, weaken that case, right? If we see that he keeps talking about the same phenomenon. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through, I may do a bit of reading. I'm going to try not to read too much, but there's some kind of finicky, detailed stuff that'll be useful to read rather than try to conjure up on the fly. And so that being said, what I'm going to try to do is kind of walk you through what I take to be Marx's ethical vision that is consistent throughout his work, and then talk about what it means for Marx to say that morality ought to be abolished. Because I think in addition to the alienation argument, the other good reason to think that Marx doesn't have a moral picture or that he's sort of opposed to morality as such is that he talks about abolishing it, right? And then he talks about it in glowing terms, right? And sees it as something desirable and worth doing. So I want to lay some groundwork and then talk about what I think Marx means by that and why it doesn't license us actually to think that Marxism is an amoral theory. So you can't talk about well, there's some disagreement about this. I think you can't talk about alienation without talking about what it is alienation from, right? And so alienation brings along with it, at least in the kind of tradition that Marx is operating within, the notion of a concept of human nature, right? A notion of what it would be like for human beings to be unalienated, right? To live as they should, or at least to have a kind of appearance, to get very Hegelian about this, right? An appearance that is in accord with their essence, right? And so then the question is, well, what's meant by that, right? What is a human essence? What is human nature? And there are, this is another point of disagreement in Marxist theory. A lot is going to hinge on what we take essence to be or human nature to be. So Marx does not take any sort of static set of human qualities and claim that that is human nature, right? So he's very explicit about this. He sort of details other kinds of rival theories. So you might think that human beings are essentially rational, or that they're essentially political animals. Maybe you think that they are essentially God's children, right? There's all these kinds of things that you might think. And Marx himself argues that that human beings are species beings, and what this means is that our essential human nature is the labor process itself. That what is essential about human beings is that we produce our own being with a capital B. And this is, I like to put this in the following way, which I think that the most distinctive, most important kind of touchstone for interpreting Marx or for attempting to engage in historical materialist critique is always to center the claim that human being is a human product, right? That all of human life is a human product. And that is my touchstone, right? When I, in any kind of theorizing that I do, right, is always remembering that. And this is going to be important for us here, because that's going to include morality, right? Not just the specific moral theories, right? So no one is going to find it particularly profound that, Kantianism is a product of Kant, right? And so on and so forth, right? But these kinds of deeper metaethical notions, right, that what is morally the case is a human product, but also that the whole notion, or the fact that there are matters of the fact about morality itself is a human product, which is to say it emerges in the course of history, and importantly for Marx, can pass back out of being in the course of human history, right? And that's going to be important for us in thinking about what Marx means by this. So Marx's conception of human nature is extremely broad and all-embracing, right? It's going to have as its implication that literally everything that human beings do and are is human nature, right? That it is this. So I say essential human nature is a complex of all these myriad appearances and of the process that yields these separate appearances and makes such a wide and varying array of them possible at all. And this is the labor process. human beings' goal-directed intervention into their natural and social environment, an intervention that human beings initiate in order to satisfy their needs and through which they transform their environment and themselves in the process. Human nature for Marx is best understood not just in terms of what we are, but also in terms of the generative activity through which we produce ourselves as we are. So one thing that folks say right away, right, is, well, wait a second, right? If the thought here is that it is problematic, maybe even immoral and unethical to have conditions in which human beings are alienated from their human nature, but you just told me that human nature is whatever it is that human beings are doing, right? And oh yeah, and you said some stuff about the labor process, right? Then how could that possibly function as a normative principle, right? And I argue that for Marx, the way that this shows up in various contexts is an analysis of a situation or an action or a practice, and then a question: does this promote human beings' capacity to intervene rationally into their own development, or does it hinder it? Right? So that's the way in which this is a kind of normative principle and an ideal. Some things do and some things don't. Famously, in Marx's opinion, capitalism thwarts this process. So this is something that we see as early as the meaning of human requirements, one of the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, where Marx criticizes capitalism not only because it fails to satisfy people's needs, but more damningly, because it frustrates the process through which human beings would generate new needs. And it's that dynamic in which human beings satisfy their needs, do so in increasingly sophisticated ways that then transform their environments and in turn themselves, thereby producing new needs, right? And creating this kind of in principle, unlimited process of human development. For Marx, the fact that capitalism frustrates this, prevents it from happening, right? Reduces people to the barest scraping to satisfy their biological needs. This is a criticism of it, right? It's a condemnation of it. And it's one that we see him continuing to make throughout his writings. So while he doesn't, or while he sometimes uses the term alienation and sometimes doesn't, as I said, he uses the concept, although not by that name. But another concept that he uses consistently and never drops is the concept of individuality. And folks are sometimes surprised, right, by this because whatever the legacy of anti-communism, honestly, that, you know, like this notion that Marx is just thinking about some sort of gray, faceless collective or something like that. But the notion of the individual and of individuality is central for Marx throughout his writings. He never gives it up. And it's this kind of flourishing of individual people, their ability to engage in any number of kind of self-directed developments of their own interests and talents and so on, that Marx sees as a mark of the kind of flourishing of the species, right? He talks about individuality itself as a historical achievement of human beings, right? He argues that human beings begin as herd animals, and over the course of history and the increasing development of their social life, individuality emerges and individuals emerge. And he sees the development of not the kind of abstract individualism of liberal theory, which he critiques regularly, but a kind of concrete individuality, right? Even if we look at the first words of the German ideology, we see him saying, you know, we're looking not at man, right, but at the actual individual people, right, and how are they functioning. I'm scrolling because I want to talk to you about rich individuality. So, so Marx, over the course of his writings, develops a distinctively historical materialist ethical vision based on human beings, and this is a quote from the Grundrisse in the preparatory materials for Capital, in their actual, empirically perceptible process of development under definite conditions, and the requirements that must be satisfied in order to bring about the circumstances in which we might see what Marx calls the, quote, all-sided development of rich individuality. He examines the goals of such important struggles as the French Revolution and considers how they represent the highest consciousness about what is necessary in order for human beings to both preserve the historical gains of class societies and move closer toward an all-sided development. Based on his understanding of these struggles, their aims, and their historical role, together with his understanding of human nature, Marx draws the conclusion that, quote, man is the highest being for man, and that human development itself is therefore the most important goal for human beings. And in his criticisms of other moral theories and of existing class society, his standard becomes clear. A moral philosophy must promote the continued existence of humanity, the preservation of its joint, universal, multicultural cultural heritage and all its diversity and achievements, and the rich individuality and all-sided development of human needs and capacities. So in the Grundrisse, Marx asserts the desirability of the following, and this is a quote from the Grundrisse. He says, the development of the rich individuality, which is as all-sided in its production as in its consumption, and whose labor also therefore appears no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself, in which natural necessity in its direct form has disappeared because a historically created need has taken the place of the natural one. So when Marx refers to the rich individuality that could first be developed in communist society, he refers to the human being in whom human essence has been brought into accordance with human appearance. Instead of appearing as a debased, limited creature, hampered and controlled by economic laws, the human is an essentially social being with a capacity for, in principle, unlimited development through the labor process. And she also appears to be so in a society in which the natural world and the social sphere have been brought under human beings' conscious and rational control and directed on the basis of human needs. So I want to. There's lots more to say about this, but having kind of set that background, I want to move to this claim, this claim about the abolition of morality, which is what which is what the title of the talk is. So, but it's impossible to get into it without doing some background work. Okay. So as I've already happily conceded, right? The folks who read Marxism as a kind of amoralist theory, wrong as I think they are, I cannot say that they're totally, unreasonable, right? They're not entirely without a rationale. Marx does describe the abolition of morality as one of the welcome achievements of the communist movement. So we have to talk about what that means and how to understand it within the context of what looks like an ethical story, right? So you can tell the kind of story that Alan Wood does about this sorts of thing, right? So his argument, Daniel Brudney makes a similar move. He says, well, Marx says this stuff, but he just didn't notice that he actually wasn't theoretically entitled to make these kinds of moral claims, right? So you just propose a sort of deep disconnect, right, in Marx's theory. And you won't be surprised to hear that that's not my approach, right? That I actually think that all of this can be reconciled if we are consistent in thinking about the implications of a historical materialist approach to this question. Yeah, let me just get into it. So without a firm grasp of the historicity of Marxist theory, it's all too easy to conflate Marx's predictions, or I should say even his hopes, right, about what lies in the future with descriptions of the world at present. Because we are not yet, you won't be surprised to hear, we're not in a fully developed communist society. So Marx's claims about what that society might be like or what might be there or not doesn't license us to make any direct conclusions about what he thinks is the case for us today, right? Morality is an attempt to theorize and close the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And Marxism is a theory that posits that the world can indeed be made what it should be, right? This is why people call us dreamers and and fools, I guess, wrongly. But we are not there yet, right? We're still working on it. And so here, for now, moral reasoning remains indispensable, right? So it's both true that morality is valid, salient, and necessary in our current conditions, and that it will eventually lose this salience in a transition to a fully developed communist society. So I think if the claim seems odd, we can think about the person who announces that after very careful moral analysis and contemplation, they have finally arrived at the conclusion that it would be morally wrong for them to harm an innocent stranger purely for their own private gratification, right? Imagine that person on the one side, and now imagine another person to whom the desire to do such a thing, and therefore the attendant moral question, just never occurs, right? So I think people can disagree, philosophers disagree about this, normal people don't, but the fact that for the first person, it even comes up as a moral question at all, I think speaks unflatteringly, right, to their character. And in Marxist theory, the notion is that a similar comparison can be made on the level of the species, right? That morality is a contingent historical ideological form that has come into existence at a definite point in history and will pass out of existence once certain historical conditions are met, if they are met. It's worth noting here that the word you know, these translations, of course, are never super direct, but the word that Marx uses that I'm talking about is his discussion of die Moral, right? So the idea of like moral commands, right? So it's in the Communist Manifesto that Marx most clearly articulates the notion of morality's abolition. He defends it in the course of a debate that he imagines between himself and a bourgeois interlocutor. That interlocutor charges the following, right? Namely, and this is Marx's interpretation of the bourgeois interlocutor. So here's the quote: communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience, right? So this is the bourgeois critic's charge against Marxism, against communism. Now, the accusation here is at least twofold. First, that communism treats as merely historical and contingent what ought to be regarded as eternal and necessary. And second, that communism unjustifiably rejects the inductive hypothesis that the future will be like the past, and that therefore morality will be as valid in the future as it has been in the past. Marx responds that indeed communism does abolish morality. As it is the fact of class exploitation that gives rise to morality, it is only fitting that morality should vanish with the, quote, total disappearance of class antagonisms. So here's his reply, right? He says, undoubtedly religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survived this change, right? And this is all part of the bourgeois critic. So Marx replies, what does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms, antagonisms that assumed different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages: the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder then that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. And he concludes, the communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. What does Marx mean here? So we have to attend to the historicized character of Marx's claims. He does not claim that morality is illusory now or that it has no validity now. However, he does claim that morality, rather than being a permanent feature of human social being, is a particular socio-historically located ideological product of human thinking and activity. Morality, Marx argues, emerges out of particular social circumstances, namely the exploitation of one part of humanity by another, and would disappear with the eradication of that exploitation. So from this, we can establish that Marx is discussing a transition of ideal forms that will attend the transition of material circumstances from an economic system based on exploitation and artificial scarcity to one based on abundance and human solidarity. But interpretive alternatives remain. So this distinction still does not settle the question of exactly what is meant by an abolition of morality. And there are a few reasonable ways to work out what the phrase might mean for Marx. Things he might mean include, first, that there might not be any genuine fact of the matter about morality in a fully developed communist society. Second, he could mean that there would be genuine facts of the matter about morality in such a society, but that the members of society would not engage in distinctively moral reasoning in order to ascertain those facts. Third, he could think that people in such a society might engage in forms of shared deliberative reasoning that, taken in isolation, would be indistinguishable from the forms of reasoning we count in our society as doing moral theory. However, it could be that such reasoning would not be properly moral, just because in a non-exploitative society, that reasoning would not serve the role of grappling with actually existing exploitative social relations. So let's consider these alternatives in order. The first alternative is the one that construes Marx's prediction most radically and counterintuitively, but also, I think, most accurately. So on this reading for Marx, a fully developed communist society is a society without any fact of the matter at all about what is morally required. For the members of a fully developed communist society, pro-social ways of being are not obligations or claims made against them. They are simply their already fully inhabited and fully expressed ways of being. Human beings in such a society would be no more morally required to behave in pro-social ways than they are morally required to be primates. It would simply be a fact of their being. It helps again here to think, as I do, and as Marx does, of morality as concerning a kind of gap, right, between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. So if alienation is abolished, and if the seeming contradiction between human appearance and human essence is reconciled, there's no gap, right? Human beings are as they should be. They are in, I want to say they are what they are what they truly are, which sounds a little flip, but it's actually the most accurate way, actually, to capture what's happening, Marx. But you know, their appearance is reconciled with their essence, right? They are in their kind of true flourishing nature. So with no gap, no fact of the matter about what ought to be done to close the gap, right? So consider in this context, Marx's and Engels' claim in the German ideology that, quote, morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness have no history, no development, but men developing their material production and their material intercourse alter, along with this, their real existence, their thinking, and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. So to interpret the abolition of morality as a state in which there is no fact of the matter about morality at all best expresses historical materialist ideology critique. Morality is not some independent, abstract, external set of commandments handed down to humanity from the outside. It rises eminently from human conditions and forms of being. If the forms of alienated, exploited social being that give rise to morality go away, then morality as such goes with them. The second interpretive possibility I presented above is that to say that morality is abolished in a fully developed communist society is simply to say that while there might be facts of the matter about what is morally right or wrong, the members of such a society wouldn't engage in distinctively moral reasoning in order to arrive at those facts. Unlike the first alternative, there is no robust meta-ethical claim here about the standing or validity of moral claims as such. On the first alternative, no one in a fully developed communist society is, properly speaking, morally obligated to do anything at all. On the second alternative, the members of that future society might well be morally obligated to do all sorts of things. It is only that they don't represent those obligations to themselves in thought, and they do not do moral theory in order to determine what it is that they are obligated to do. So on that interpretive alternative, they simply discharge their obligations because it is embedded in their forms of life that they do so. And we could think here of Hegel's notion of Sittlichkeit, or ethical life. A fully developed communist society would then be one made up of people for whom morally correct behavior has become totally habitual and customary. And the third proffered alternative is one we should regard as worth considering, yet I think least likely and compelling, right? And that is that people would continue to engage in forms of discourse that look awfully like the kind of thing that happens today in seminars and conferences about normative moral theory. However, despite formal similarities, it wouldn't be that, since contingently nothing in a fully developed communist society could be moral theory, because it would have no subject matter to be about. So these possibilities are not strictly mutually exclusive. Some combination of the three could co-occur. And we might make the best sense of Marxist theory by interpreting him to hold both that there would be no moral facts of the matter in a fully developed communist society, and that individuals in such a society would behave in pro-social ways as a matter of habituation to do so, although properly speaking, this would no longer be moral. So should we then say that Marx's theory is amoral because it presages a world without morality as such? I think the answer is no. Once again, such a world is not our world, and in our world, there remains much work to be done in order to do away with the alienation and economic exploitation that stifle human flourishing and solidarity. I'm going to skip past, so there's the next thing that happens in this chapter is that I just list various philosophers who have thought it was at least an in principle theoretical possibility that human beings could be so habituated into pro-social ways of interacting with one another that they wouldn't need or engage in moral reasoning. I'm going to cut that because I'm just going to just pick your favorite one. A number of philosophers make claims of this sort: Rawls, Kant, Hume, right? A number of people say it, but they just dismiss it as like purely an in principle possibility, but not a possibility for imperfect beings such as ourselves, right? And the point of that is that, well, here's the real point: is that having given earlier versions, right, of this kind of argument, I would sometimes be confronted with folks saying, I just don't understand what you could possibly mean by this claim that there'd be no fact of the matter about what's morally required of human beings. And the point of listing these familiar figures who all say something of this type is to force that kind of critic to acknowledge that what they mean is that they disagree, not that they don't understand it, right? They understand the claim, they just think it's implausible, which is fine, right? But the claim itself, right, is not so very exotic or bizarre, right? What is distinct for Marx, right, is the notion that this doesn't have to remain just a kind of pure in principle kind of thought experiment, and that the antisocial ways in which human beings behave are a human product, right? That these are not ineradicable features of human life that we lack control over, right? That these kinds of social habits and practices in which we engage are phenomena that can be brought under our conscious and rational control to create a different kind of society and different ways of interacting with one another. So here too, right, this notion that human life is a human product, right, and that as such, it is the sort of thing that is susceptible to rational human intervention, right, is like the key, right, in thinking about historical materialism and what it implies, right? For morality, for how we talk about human nature, right, et cetera, for how we think about history and so on. And so, okay, so I'm skipping that part, but just telling you a bit about, you know, what it is and why it's there. So Marx holds out the possibility that when human beings alter their society to do away with the exploitation and degradation of human beings, they will also affect an alteration so profound that it will make pro-social forms of human interaction utterly habitual and customary. And if that is so, then it's not quite so puzzling what he might mean when he claims in the manifesto that communism would abolish morality. It would be a world of Aristotle's phronomoi, of Hegel's Sittlichkeit fully realized, of Kant's realm of ends, a world where Rawls's circumstances of justice are replaced by conditions of material abundance, and in Marx's own words, a world in which human brotherhood would be no mere phrase with us, but a fact of life. Thank you.